Business Book Summaries. Get ready for the unbelievable tale of Hugo Boss and the history of their fancy fashion business empire. We'll find out, how did Hugo Boss start? Why is the history of Hugo Boss a big deal? Did they really make uniforms for the Nazis? Why did Joe Lycett change his name to Hugo Boss? How did Hugo Boss become so popular? There's a bunch to learn about business and marketing from Hugo Boss. All of this and more in this short story about Hugo Boss. We all have secrets, but some are much darker than others. Hugo Boss, the fashion brand known for its association with wealth, elegance, and status, is worn by numerous famous celebrities. However, behind its glamorous image lies a hidden history. This is the tale of how Hugo Boss supported Hitler, produced uniforms for the Nazis, and yet managed to rebrand itself and establish a global fashion empire. Part 1. The fascinating beginnings of Hugo Boss. Hugo Boss was born in Germany in 1885, in a town renowned for its textile industry. His parents owned a small lingerie shop, which sparked Hugo's interest in fashion from a young age. During his teenage years, he took various jobs to learn about the fashion industry. He started as an apprentice merchant, then worked in a textile mill, and eventually took over his parents' lingerie shop. When World War I broke out, Hugo seized the chance to serve his country. Though he survived the war, he returned with a fresh vision for his life. Instead of running his parents' shop, he aimed to establish his own fashion company. He transformed the shop into a tailor's and named it after himself. Having gained experience from an early age, Hugo rapidly expanded his shop into a factory, selling jackets, shirts, workwear, sportswear, and raincoats. His background as an apprentice merchant made him a skilled salesman, and his brand gained recognition across Germany. However, the aftermath of World War I burdened Germany with massive reparations to pay off. This led to economic struggles and a tough period. While other countries enjoyed prosperity, Germany faced inflation and closures of businesses. Despite Hugo Boss's popularity, people couldn't afford his clothing. The Great Depression worsened Germany's situation. Scarce food, unemployment, and financial hardships gripped the nation. In an attempt to save his business, Hugo started making uniforms for the German police and officials. But this wasn't enough, and he eventually had to lay off workers, close the factory, and declare bankruptcy, leaving him with only 6 sewing machines. It seemed like Hugo Boss's fashion dream might fade away. Part 2. Striking a pact with the devil. Desperate for assistance, Germany turned to anyone who could help. This was the time when Adolf Hitler rose to power. Hugo Boss saw this as an opportunity. He knew that those connected to the Nazi Party could secure government contracts, so he became a fervent supporter of the Nazis and an active member of the party from 1931 onward. He built relationships with high-ranking party members, positioning himself as a prime candidate to create the new Nazi uniforms. Hugo's efforts paid off. He secured a contract to manufacture their uniforms. With just 6 sewing machines, Hugo began his work, initially crafting Nazi uniforms like the infamous brown shirts. As the Nazi Party gained strength, they needed more uniforms for various roles, such as soldiers, police, and the Hitler Youth. Thanks to his Nazi connections, Hugo expanded his production to cater to these demands. Of course, 6 sewing machines were insufficient to meet the growing need. Hugo Boss obtained loans to expand his company, acquire more equipment, and hire additional employees. This allowed him to grow his tailoring business and produce the array of uniforms required by the Nazis. And looking at it from a money point of view, supporting Hitler turned out to be very profitable for Hugo Boss. He made a lot more money than ever before. When Hitler started taking over Europe, Hugo Boss got help from forced laborers from France and Poland. So, he had these forced workers in his factory, making uniforms for the Nazi Party and the SSS. Unlike some other German business owners at the time, Hugo did let his new workers eat in the canteen instead of work camps, and he made sure they got food regularly. But, on the downside, these workers lived in really bad conditions. Hugo would threaten to send them to concentration camps if they couldn't keep up with their work. As for Hugo Boss's own beliefs, it's clear that publicly being a Nazi Party member was kind of a smart movie. Remember, before Hitler became powerful and Hugo got in with the Nazis to get those contracts, Hugo's business had failed, and he was in a very bad financial situation with little hope for success. A researcher who wrote a book about Hugo Boss said, "It's clear that Hugo F. Boss didn't just join the party for uniform contracts, but also because he believed in National Socialism, and he was a strong Nazi supporter." Reportedly, he even hung a picture of himself with Hitler in his apartment. So, even if he got involved to save his business, he probably would have supported them anyway. Luckily, when the war ended and the Nazis lost, Hugo Boss got investigated. Because he was an active member of the Nazi Party and benefited from it, he wasn't allowed to run a business anymore. Just a few years later, in 1948, Hugo Boss died. You might think that would be the end of the company with his name on it. But, as we know, that's not what happened. Today, Hugo Boss is a really big clothing business. So, how did that happen? Part 3. Making a New Start. After Hugo Boss died, his son-in-law Eugen Holy took over what was left of the company. He kept it going by making uniforms for the police and postal workers. Selling uniforms helped, but the Hugo Boss brand wasn't as strong anymore. They didn't have those big Nazi contracts. In the early 1950, they got an order to make suits. This was a turning point for the company. The suits became popular, and Eugen realized they could change the company's image and move away from the Nazi past. They started making more suits and focused on making them really good quality and stylish. This paid off, and Hugo Boss became known for making great suits, not just uniforms. Under Hugo's son-in-law's leadership, the business got even bigger than when Hugo was running it. Of course, the company tried to keep Hugo Boss's political views private. They knew it would be really bad for their image if people found out the truth. But it was a struggle to distance themselves from their founder and his support for Hitler. In 1969, Eugen retired and passed the business to his two sons, so now it was the third generation running the company. These two brothers were even more ambitious. They wanted to make Hugo Boss a global fashion icon. Part 4. The Boss Era. The two brothers, who took over the company from their father, decided to focus on marketing Hugo Boss as a brand exclusively for men, particularly known for top-quality suits. Even though they concentrated on a narrow range of clothing, it turned out to be an advantage. This focus allowed them to ensure the quality of their products, especially in men's suits. As a result, their products quickly gained a strong reputation. At that time, German suits were usually made with stiff and heavy materials. But the brothers broke away from tradition and started using softer and lighter materials from Italy to make their suits. They also updated their factories and hired more workers to make more suits. These changes fulfilled their father's dream of Hugo Boss being associated with post-war German excellence rather than its Nazi past. In a surprising move, the company started making some of its products in other countries. This is common now, but it was rare for a proud German company to do this back then. Since the company had changed so much from making uniforms and workwear, the brothers felt a rebrand was necessary. That's when they started marketing the brand simply as Boss. Things were going really well for the company under the brothers' leadership. Their suits were popular in Germany, and they wanted to expand globally. To achieve this, they invested heavily in marketing. They wisely spent money on endorsement deals, getting the Boss logo on race cars driven by famous racers. This made the brand more recognizable internationally and led to the first Boss suit being sold in the United States in 1976. They also paid big amounts to have famous stars like Sylvester Stallone wear their suits and become the face of the Boss brand. Their timing was perfect, as the 1980 saw the rise of the yuppie movement, where people wanted to look like CEOs and entrepreneurs, making stylish suits a must-have. With high-quality materials, strong advertising, and endorsements, Boss suits became highly sought after. Despite initially focusing on men's suits, this alone brought in huge profits. However, once they established themselves as a popular suit brand, the brothers saw the opportunity to make even more money by expanding into other product lines. In 1985, they started selling their own fragrances, starting with Boss No. 1 for men. This fragrance became one of their most successful products, marking the beginning of their extensive fragrance business. The company was later listed on the German stock exchange. Within a year, Hugo Boss was worth more than all other German menswear manufacturers combined. In 1989, despite the great success, the brothers decided to sell most of their shares to a Japanese company called Leighton House Group. While they still had some influence in the company, they were no longer in charge of day-to-day operations. Part 5. The Changes. Unfortunately, Hugo Boss's remarkable success eventually faced challenges due to economic instability. The yuppie era declined, and economic troubles in major markets like Germany and the United States made high-end fashion less accessible for most people. By 1993, Hugo Boss stock was worth less than half of what the brothers had received for their shares just 4 years earlier. As sales continued to plummet, the new owners realized they needed to take quick action to save the company. Firstly, they divided the brand into 3. The Boss brand continued to offer high-end suits, while they also introduced the Baldessarini brand, named after Hugo Boss's chief designer, to represent the exclusive fashion side of Hugo Boss. Finally, there was a new brand introduced called Hugo, which was meant for younger customers. The company also made sure to offer some more affordable products so that people could still buy their clothes even during tough economic times. To change its image of being too focused on masculinity, the company started selling clothes and fragrances for women. All of these changes together seemed to help the company gain new customers. During the late 1990, they made a lot more money. But in 1997, the CEO Peter Littmann left. After that, different CEOs tried to continue what Littmann had started, but they weren't successful. Eventually, Hugo Boss's main designer, Baldessarini, stepped up and became the CEO. He was hesitant at first because previous CEOs had failed. But he took the job and decided to expand even more. Hugo Boss started selling sportswear, casual clothes, underwear, and accessories like sunglasses. He also realized how important it was to be famous, so he worked with the film industry to have Boss-branded clothes in popular movies. Hugo Boss also started using models again, with famous ones appearing in ads. All these choices made the brand very successful worldwide. Even now, Hugo Boss is one of the biggest and most successful fashion brands, being sold in more than 90 countries. It's impressive how Hugo Boss went from a small German tailor shop to a leading fashion brand. People still think of the brand as luxurious and well-designed. Celebrities still represent the brand recently. Chris Hemsworth took over from Sylvester Stallone as the face of Hugo Boss. But not all the attention from celebrities has been good. Part 6. Dealing with Problems. In 2013, a guy named Russell Brand got an award from GQ at a special event. This event was sponsored by Hugo Boss. Russell Brand said something that got a lot of attention. He talked about history and fashion and said that Hugo Boss made uniforms for the Nazis. He mentioned that the Nazis had some bad things about them, but their uniforms did look good. Even though Hugo Boss is still criticized for what happened in the past, they have been working to fix their mistakes. In 1999, they set up a fund to give money to the people who were forced to work as slaves and had bad experiences. Then, in 2011, Hugo Boss said sorry for the first time ever. They wrote a statement that said they feel really sorry for what happened in the past when they were making clothes under the Nazis. Nowadays, Hugo Boss is proud to help charities that focus on education and support in places where things are still developing. So here's a huge question. The person who started the company is gone, and the company is owned by a whole different group who seem to want to do good things. Does that mean we shouldn't think about the bad stuff the company did in the past? The company now is very different, with new values and bosses. But then again, it's still called Hugo Boss, so it's not easy to forget where it came from. More recently, Hugo Boss got bad attention for something else. A comedian named Joe Lycett changed his name to Hugo Boss. He did this because Hugo Boss sent letters to very small businesses telling them to stop using the word boss in their names. One example was a little brewery in Wales called Boss Brewing. They had to pay a lot of money and change their name just because Hugo Boss said so. Hugo Boss said that some of the names of their drinks, like Boss Black, were too similar to their own name. But this brewery was a tiny business, and they had nothing to do with fashion or clothes. To show how wrong this was, Joe Lycett tweeted that it seems like at HUGOBOSS doesn't like people using their name. He said that he legally changed his name to Hugo Boss to draw attention to the trademark problem they caused. All the things I'm saying now are not coming from Joe Lycett, but from Hugo Boss. So here's what really happened. Joe Lycett actually changed his name, and this news spread really quickly. It was all over the news with big headlines. Soon, people started making fun of the company. Whenever Hugo Boss posted something on Twitter, there were comments like, "Does Joe Lycett know you're using his name to sell perfumes?" Because of this whole situation, more people started talking about the problem. The problem was that a company with a lot of money was threatening really small businesses for using the word boss in their products. Then, these small businesses had to spend money to change their names. Finally, Hugo Boss, the company, said something about all of this. They said they're happy to have the comedian Joe Lycett as part of their family. They also tried to explain that they worked things out with the small businesses they had sent letters to, like Boss Brewing. But that doesn't change the fact that these small businesses had to spend a lot of money to change their names and deal with legal stuff. What surprises me the most is that many of the big fashion brands we know today have done bad things in the past. If you haven't read about these stories yet, they're actually pretty shocking. You should look them up and read them. Thanks for watching, and see you in a bit. That's everything I shared with you today. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. If you enjoyed this summary, please consider subscribing to the Business Book Summaries channel.